Imagine this. You wake before dawn and the world is wrong. The fire is dead. The air bites harder than it did yesterday. There is ash where warmth used to be, empty ground where food used to be, silence where animals used to pass. A child is crying. Someone is staring at the horizon, as if the horizon has betrayed them. Behind you, there are marks in the dirt where your people slept. In front of you, there's only distance. And then somehow you stand up and walk. That may be one of the oldest human decisions on Earth. Not building, not conquering, not even speaking. Losing everything and still moving. So why did ancient humans do it? Why, after drought, after fire, after flood, after cold, after hunger, after death, did they keep going? Why didn't they simply stop, curl inward, surrender to the weight of what had been taken from them? At first, the obvious answer seemed simple, because they had to. Ancient humans lived in a world that could turn against them without warning. Rivers shifted, herds disappeared, winters stretched, grasslands dried, forests burned, coastlines changed. A place that fed you one season could kill you in the next. If survival depended on motion, then motion was not bravery. It was necessity. But that answer is true in the smallest sense and incomplete in the largest one. Because they had to does not fully explain the strange human ability to leave behind the familiar and keep faith with what cannot yet be seen. It does not explain why the species that could grieve also became the species that could begin again. It does not explain why our ancestors carrying loss on their backs kept stepping into uncertainty as if uncertainty itself were part of the design. We often imagine ancient people as trapped inside nature, pushed around by storms and seasons like leaves in wind. But that image misses something important. They were vulnerable, yes. Exposed, yes. But they were not passive. They were readers of change. They watched the sky. They knew where the ground held water after a dry stretch. They noticed the habits of birds, the path of grazing animals, the smell of rain before it arrived, the silence that meant something had shifted. They did not survive by controlling the world. They survived by paying close enough attention to move with it. That changes the question. Maybe ancient humans did not keep moving after losing everything because they were rootless. Maybe they survived because they understood that roots can also become traps. To us, home often means a fixed place. Walls, doors, streets with names, an address that proves you belong somewhere. But for most of human existence, home was not a structure. It was a pattern, a fire carried forward, a group that remembered your name, a set of paths known by the body before they were known by the mind. Home was portable. That idea can feel strange now because modern life teaches us to worship permanence. We store our lives in buildings, passwords, records, photographs, mortgages, archives. We want stability because stability feels like safety. But ancient humans lived long enough in unstable worlds to learn a harsher wisdom. What keeps you alive is not always what stays. Sometimes it is what adapts. That is one of the deepest human paradoxes. We long for permanence, but we are built for change. And maybe that is why this story reaches past prehistory and touches something raw in the present. Because the ancient scene is not as distant as it looks. People still wake up and find the world wrong. A career disappears. A city becomes unaffordable. A war redraws the map. A storm takes the house. A diagnosis splits life into before and after. A technology changes the rules of belonging. A culture shifts beneath your feet while you are still trying to stand. And then comes the same impossible question. What do you do when the place you trusted can no longer hold you? You move. Not always across land. Sometimes across identity. Across belief. Across language. Across versions of yourself. Ancient migration was not only a physical act. It was also a mental one. To leave was to accept that memory could not become a prison. It was to carry grief without turning back into stone. It was to tell your body that the map is broken and tell your mind to make another one. That takes more than instinct. It takes imagination. People often talk about human intelligence as if it lives mainly in tools, in fire, in hunting strategies, in larger brains. But one of the most underrated human powers may be this, the ability to picture a life beyond the edge of present suffering. Before the next valley could become real, someone had to believe in it. Before the next campfire could exist, someone had to keep walking in the cold. Before a child could sleep safely again, someone had to carry both fear and direction at the same time. That is not just survival. That is faith with footprints. And yet movement was never simple. Leaving costs something. Every migration is also an amputation. You lose familiar trees, known paths, buried bones, the exact bend of the river where people laughed, the rock face that caught the evening light. Even if ancient people did not build cities, they still built attachment. They still knew places deeply enough to miss them. Loss did not begin with civilization. Loss is older than walls, which means ancient humans were not simply fleeing danger. They were constantly negotiating one of the most painful truths of being alive, that survival may demand separation from what you love. This is where the story becomes more than anthropology. Because if you look closely, the movement of ancient humans tells us something uncomfortable about ourselves. We like to believe that resilience means staying strong, staying still, holding ground. But some of the oldest resilience on Earth looked like departure. Resilience was not always a fortress. Sometimes it was a trail. Sometimes it was the humility to admit, this place cannot save us anymore. Sometimes it was the courage to become a stranger again. That matters because modern people often confuse collapse with conclusion. We lose one version of life and assume life itself has ended. But our ancestors lived in conditions so unstable that ending and beginning were often braided together. A failed hunt could lead to a new route. A drying plain could force a new alliance. A vanishing shoreline could open a new way inland. Disaster did not automatically produce wisdom, but it did produce movement. And movement created possibility. The road begins where certainty ends. That could have been the secret law of early human life. Not because uncertainty was beautiful. It often wasn't. It was brutal. Children died. People suffered. Groups split. Many journeys failed. The ancient world was not noble in a romantic way. It was dangerous and indifferent. But within that indifference, humans developed a strange talent. They kept making meaning while moving through instability. They shared memory as instruction. They told stories that turned landscape into guidance. They passed down where to go, what to avoid, when to wait, how to read the season, why the old path no longer worked. Knowledge was stored in people, and people moved. In that sense, migration was not just relocation. It was culture in motion. A camp could be lost. A story could survive. A shelter could burn. A skill could remain. A valley could disappear behind them. But if the group carried memory well, then the loss was not total. This may be why humans became so attached to narrative. A story is one of the few homes you can carry without weight. It lets the past travel into the future. It turns pain into map, memory into method, absence into warning, and wonder into inheritance. We are the species that packs meaning with the essentials. Food, fire, children, tools, story. And once you see that, ancient movement stops looking like endless wandering. It starts to look like a civilizational engine. Mobility allowed humans to spread, learn, exchange, adapt, and survive environments that should have erased them. It forced flexibility. It rewarded cooperation. It selected for attention, innovation, and social trust. You cannot cross difficulty alone for very long. Movement made the group matter. Maybe that is another reason they kept going after losing everything, because everything did not mean the same thing then that it means now. If the group remained, if knowledge remained, if the capacity to begin remained, then not everything was gone. That is a hard lesson for the modern world, because we live inside systems that constantly tell us to anchor identity in possessions, status, location, and visible success. Lose the job, the house, the image, the plan, and it can feel as though the self has been shattered. But ancient humans whisper a different definition of wealth across the ages. If you can still learn, you are not finished. If you can still move, you are not trapped. If you can still imagine, you are not empty. That does not make loss small. It makes the human response larger. And maybe that is why this question lingers. Not because it is only about the past, but because it exposes a pattern still running through us. We are descended from people who crossed distance under pressure, who carried memory through disruption, who adapted not because change was pleasant, but because stillness could be fatal. Some part of us remembers that. It may be why restlessness and hope are so strangely linked. Why we refresh the screen. Why we move cities. Why we reinvent careers. Why we leave relationships that no longer shelter us. Why we search for new language when old language stops fitting. Why even in comfort, something in us remains alert to the possibility that life may require another crossing. We are modern enough to forget the trail, but not ancient enough to stop feeling it. So when we ask why ancient humans kept moving after losing everything, the answer is not just that the world forced them to. Is that moving was one of the first ways humans turned suffering into survival. They walked not because they were fearless, but because fear itself could be carried. They walked not because they knew the future, but because they refused to let the present be final. They walked because being human has always meant living between memory and horizon. And maybe that is still true now. Maybe the deepest human strength is not the power to avoid loss. Maybe it is the power to remain unfinished by it, to gather what matters, to leave what cannot be saved, to step forward before the path deserves your trust. Ancient humans disappeared into valleys, over ridges, along coasts, across cold plains, into forests they could not yet name. Most of their footsteps are gone. The wind took them. The ground closed over them. Time erased the shape of almost every journey. But not the pattern. The pattern is still here. A human being stands in the ruins of what was supposed to last, looks into uncertainty, and goes. And perhaps that is the oldest truth our species ever learned. Sometimes the only way to keep your life is to carry it beyond the place